For the first time in Mike McDaniel's tenure as Dolphins head coach, the Dolphins have failed to make the playoffs. And it's significant because the Dolphins seem to be regressing in this stage of the rebuild. 6 years into this rebuild with Chris Greer, 3 years into it with Mike McDaniel, and the Dolphins are showing no signs of breaking that 24-year drought of not winning a playoff game. And Stephen Ross, after this loss to the Jets, basically said that he's bringing the whole crew back: Chris Greer, Mike McDaniel, Tua Tagovailoa, and they're going to run it back again to see if he gets different results this time. And most Dolphin fans are a little bit disappointed with that. There's a whole set of fans that want to see Chris Greer fired. There's some fans who want to see Greer and McDaniel fired. But, if you've been paying attention to Stephen Ross's moves, you would see that this is pretty much what he wanted from the beginning, right? He basically gave Mike McDaniel a new contract right before the season started when he didn't have to. Mike McDaniel had 2 years on the contract still. So clearly there was no real need to give him a new contract. He gave Tyreek Hill a new renegotiated deal that, he didn't have to do. Tyreek Hill was under contract for 2 more years, even though he didn't have any guaranteed money. And, it's very likely he gave Chris Greer a deal, even though that was never reported to the media. So Stephen Ross had planned to bring this whole regime back unless the Dolphins had a really catastrophic season. Then maybe he would have reevaluated his decision. But as far as the narrative of this season goes, Stephen Ross, I believe, think that if Tua hadn't gotten hurt and missed 6 games in the regular season, then it's a possibility the Dolphins would have made the playoffs and likely won a playoff game. So that's the way he processes this whole thing. I can only assume, right? I can't speak for Stephen Ross, but that's what I think is going through his head. But, if you've been watching the Dolphins on the field, you would see that this is a team that's showing no signs of improvement anytime soon. They have an aging roster. Some of their star players are getting older. Guys like Tyreek Hill and Jalen Ramsey are both over 30 going into next season. And, Teron Armstead looks like he might be on the cusp of retirement. Kendall Lamb isn't coming back. He said that he was retiring at the end of the season. So you have a team that's getting older. You have a roster that's getting older. Bradley Chubb is getting older. And Jalen Phillips is rehabbing. So the Dolphins team is a team that really don't have a whole lot of stability in terms of the roster construction going into the future. They have to rebuild their offensive line. They have to rebuild their linebackers. They have to rebuild their secondary, particularly the safeties. So, this Dolphins team, in the midst of a grand rebuild, seems like they have to rebuild again. Some people like to call it a retooling. I mean, it's all semantics at this point: retooling, rebuilding, whatever. The fact is, this roster isn't good enough. Chris Greer hasn't built a roster that's stable enough in the trenches in order to win physical football games. Mike McDaniel doesn't seem to be able to coach a team that's physical and play physically against other playoff teams or teams that are winning teams in the NFL. So this is what you're left with if you're a Dolphin fan. You have to hope in 2025 that Tua can stay healthy for 17 games. You have to hope that Chris Greer can rebuild an offensive line that he struggled to rebuild in his last at least 6 years since he's been the official GM. But since 2016, when he was appointed a GM, he hasn't really rebuilt the offensive line to the point where it can be reliable from year to year. There've been fleeting moments when, they've had like good moments here and there, like when they had Mike Pouncey and those offensive line that played for Adam Gase when Jay Ajayi ran for 200-yard games in 2016. But outside of that, the Dolphins didn't really have a lot of consistency on the offensive line. Health has always been an issue. And they traded Laremy Tunsil for a boatload of picks. But, when you look at the returns from that, and then you look at how the Dolphins have struggled at the left tackle position, I'm not really sure they got a real good return on the investment based upon how they spent that draft capital. So the Dolphins really have a roster that's aging. They need serious repair at a lot of critical positions. And they also need their quarterback to stay healthy for 16, 17 games in the season. They have to address the backup quarterback situation, the second string quarterback, and possibly a third string quarterback if they don't bring Tyler Huntley back. Tyler Huntley seems like he might be a little bit out of his depth. So they might have to bring another quarterback in, maybe two quarterbacks. So, this team seems to be as far away from contention as it's ever been. And on top of all that, like if this isn't bad enough, Tyreek Hill is asking to be traded. He wants out, he says. And, the Dolphins just really gave him some guaranteed money going into the season, which they didn't have to. Now that they gave him the guaranteed money, now it'll be difficult to trade him or move on from him without having taken a significant salary cap hit. So the dead cap money that's going to come from Tyreek Hill's trade or his release is something the Dolphins didn't really have to deal with if they had just stood pat and allowed Tyreek Hill to play in his last 2 years of his contract with no guaranteed money. So, this whole thing is just seems to be an evolving mess, and it doesn't seem like there's any clarity on when it's going to end in the future. But Mike McDaniel said at this, the final press conference, the final game press conference after the Jet game, he said that, he was pretty confident that he was going to be brought back. So clearly, Stephen Ross assured him either before the game or leading up to the game, or maybe even in the offseason, probably guaranteed Mike McDaniel he'd be back in 2025. And even if Mike McDaniel comes back, I mean, there's so many things he needs to improve upon in order for the Dolphins to be a competitive team. I'm not really sure if Mike McDaniel's capable at this point. I mean, he's had some fleeting moments where he's beaten some really bad teams in the regular season, particularly at home, but the team doesn't really have a whole lot to hang on in terms of an identity with Mike McDaniel. If they had to describe the identity of the Miami Dolphins, it seems as though they're soft. They have difficulty playing against the better teams in the league, particularly playoff teams or teams with winning records. And the Dolphins really have a very player-friendly management style that I'm not sure translates into successful football. Some of the beat writers even questioned it going into the regular season that, Dolphins training camp, wasn't really a physical affair. Guys didn't really practice all the time. There was a lot of load management. There was I guess they felt that if they managed the players' reps in training camp, that they'll be healthier at the end of the season. And, I don't know if that's true or not, if the Dolphins were more healthy than they had been in the past because of the load management. I'm sure, the people in charge of that can probably figure that out. But in terms of the team being sharp at the beginning of the season, that wasn't the case, right? The Dolphins didn't look like a particularly sharp team. They looked like a team that was playing their preseason games in weeks 1 and 2. So they didn't get off to a good start because of likely that relaxed training camp. And then at the end of the season, they still weren't healthy because the starting quarterback missed the last 2 games. So I'm not really sure where the load management, where the player-friendly training camp, where that translated to results for this Dolphins team. And, Mike McDaniel has to really reevaluate everything that he does for this team. And quite frankly, I'm not sure he's capable at this point. He has his own management style, his own player-friendly style. And, I'm sure he has a lot of good intentions when it comes to those things, but it's not yielding any results. And now you have players like Tyreek Hill not only demanding a trade, but refusing to come into the game when, it's at the end of the fourth quarter. And I guess Mike McDaniel, was told that Tyreek Hill wasn't available and it was not a new injury. So basically, it seems as though Tyreek Hill basically checked out the game. And, to have that kind of blatant insubordination at the end of a game, it just shows you the level of respect your superstar player, your team captain has for the head coach. And once the players start to disrespect the head coach, there's a very good chance you can lose the locker room. So I'm not sure how well this will bode for Mike McDaniel in the future. The Dolphins have to plan on 2025 without having Tyreek Hill in the roster, and it's going to be a very difficult 2025 season for the Dolphins. Other teams in the league are getting better, and the Dolphins right now seem to be getting worse at the worst time. So we'll see how it plays out going into the off season. But from where I stand right now, running this whole thing back, expecting different results in 2025, just doesn't seem to be the smartest move for Stephen Ross at this time. So that's it for this video. If you like this video, leave a comment in the section below. And as always, I'll see you in the next video.